There we go. Okay, well, welcome to April. Our fourth module tonight is how to grow things intensively in really small areas, or how to grow the most in whatever garden size you have. You might have a very small area for a garden, even if your property is bigger, because we all know that most of us have to have deer fencing and fairly expensive infrastructure to have a vegetable garden safely, screened, keeping out rabbits and deer. So even if you don't have a small property, you might have a small garden. And then I'm also going to talk about growing food in containers. And I'll have a little bit of information about greenhouses, just touching on the high points of managing them, but on some design points in case you are thinking of a greenhouse or you haven't been happy with how the greenhouse you do have has performed. There may be some changes to ventilation, for example, that you can make. But first, I'm going to talk about what we're going to do this month. We can seed peas. Now, seeding outdoors, it still has not been very warm, but this month we surely will be able to plant all of our cool season things this early. But don't panic if your garden is not ready by the end of this month. May is a perfectly good time to do the planting that I list here: peas, root crops, lettuce, greens, cabbage family. But if you're really anxious and eager and you've got little plants and seeds, I actually put my peas out the other day, as I said. They were about like what was in the tray here, but they're not really doing anything. But anyway, this month is we can get on with that. You can put out seedlings. And if you've chitted your seed potatoes, if you remember from last month, chitting means putting your seed potatoes on a sunny windowsill so that the sprouts they grow are very short and dark, not those poor sprouty sprouts that happen in darkness in a bag somewhere. What we want is these short, dense little sprouts. This will really get a jump start on your potato crop because they will get their shoots started while they're at room temperature. We can put out onion sets and seedlings by the end of this month, and leek seedlings. I'm hoping that nothing untoward happens, but usually they can be planted safely. After May 1st, we may be able, you can start corn and beans seeds indoors. So I think we're meeting the first week of May. So about the time we meet again, you might want to start some of your earlier plantings. I'm sure the soil will be too cold to put corn seed and bean seed out in the soil, but you could get a good head start with sprouting them just in trays like this. And right now you can plant squash, melons, cucumbers, and basil indoors in seed flats. I just sowed mine 3 days ago, and actually one of the squash has already come up. I'm quite surprised. It's a zucchini, so you might know, very vigorous. It's usually I used to start squash and cucumbers and things, at the end of March, and now I waited well into the first week of April was gone, because for the last several springs I've just ended up with plants in pots that couldn't go out because it was cold. Or if I did give up and put them out, they really suffered a bad setback. So I'm just waiting. I'm starting things later and trying to grow them quickly when they do come up. I've had several people ask over the years about getting carrots started, and one person in this class asked about it too. And I thought, I'll just do a slide about it. This slide I just did the other day, so it's not in the slide set that's on the website for you to download. But it's sort of tucked in as an extra, because the problem with carrots is they're the easiest crop in the garden to grow once you get them started. But they are a real pain sometimes to get a good stand of carrots. One of the problems is they're very slow to germinate. So in this weather, it could take a couple weeks for it to germinate. Even in May, it'll take a couple weeks. And in the meantime, weeds can spring up, or they might have spent a period of time not properly watered if it's dry. The soil has to be moist through the entire germination period. Now, we have had situations where the first week of May, we had a heat wave, and that promptly fried everybody's carrots that they had just put out, because they won't germinate if the soil is too warm. And if they dry up while they've germinated and they're trying to get sprouted, and then they get too warm and dry, that can kill them too. So just a warning that right now the problem is getting the soil warm enough, but it could change in a couple of weeks, and the problem might be warm soil, in which case cover the seed beds with burlap or something. I often take a compost bag and cut it open, and it's white plastic inside. Turn it white side up, and that is a really good shade for any seed bed. So slow germination is an issue. The other thing is that they're really tiny plants, and everybody likes to eat them. Cutworms, slugs, pill bugs, everybody can eat them. And they can eat a lot of little seedlings in one night because the seedlings are so tiny. So if you're plagued by cutworms, the best thing to do is just don't try and seed carrots in April, because the cutworms are these big fat caterpillars. They pupate, usually the end of April, first week of May. And then when they're in a pupa stage, they don't eat anything. So you just can just wait them out, and then they suddenly become a non-problem. If it's slugs, and usually both of them actually, with slugs, get slug bait, get the safe baits with iron in it. Foxglove has it, but every nursery carries it. And seed the carrots, water the bed, and then sprinkle a light sprinkling of slug bait on top of the bed, and you'll have up to 2 weeks to control the slugs before the carrots come up. Now, pill bugs, though, are another problem, because they can eat little tiny carrot seedlings too. And pill bugs are funny because most of the time they're not a problem, and then sometimes there's suddenly a huge number. And I don't really know why, except if there's been a lot of wet weather, that they obviously thrive in that because they're crustaceans, they're not insects. So if you have had pill bugs in the past, and you're really only going to know that by going out in the evening and seeing who's feeding on your carrots, that's a good idea anyway. If you're seeding carrots and you see little seedlings, then you don't see seedlings, and then you know that a critter has eaten them. Go out after dark and see who's out there. Because if it's a lot of pill bugs, then for your next planting of carrots, let the soil get really, really dry, if possible, before you seed. The pill bugs are, because they're crustaceans, they have to be in really damp conditions. And, a couple of weeks of just having a soil bed really, really dry, they'll be going elsewhere. So that'll help. The other thing you can do is you could start the seeds in flats, and you can actually transplant carrots. It's a pain, but for spring sowing, that might be what you need to do. Pill bugs, all of these pests are not a problem, or rarely a problem later in the summer. Slugs, pill bugs, and of course the cutworms will be gone. So by the time you're seeding carrots to eat for winter, these are usually a non-issue. Usually this is a spring, cool, wet weather spring issue. And once they get going, thin them and carry on. As long as the pH is not really acidic, they're root crops. They don't thrive particularly well in very acid soil, but they have deep roots. They're really quite durable once you get a good start. I know that you may see on the internet gardening recommendations to lay boards down on top of a carrot bed during germination. And I don't know where those people live, but they don't live in the slug universe, capital of the universe. So do not put boards down on the beds. Slugs will just go under there and eat your carrots up quite happily. Once you've seeded anything on this list, anything at all, but particularly peas, put some kind of protection over them. It could be floating row cover. This is kind of my past protectors. It was every piece of wire and screening and everything I had in the house. But last year I went to the Windsor plywood and bought to our local building center and bought this 1-inch welded wire material. It's very, very strong. And just made boxes. You just bend in the corner, miter the corners. And these boxes are self-supporting entirely. They're very sturdy. They're 6 inches high, and some are 8 inches high. and they're absolutely fantastic. You just make them modularly to fit your beds, and now it's so easy. This material comes in different widths. You can buy whatever you want as far as widths. I think I bought, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 4 feet wide. Yes, so I ended up with 6 inches as on either side as the height, and I have 3 foot wide modules here. The thing that I found about these was, once I had been using them for protecting the seeds from birds, it turns out they're fantastic for small seedlings to use them for shade cloth and to support shade cloth. Or I have all this lace curtain material. Well, it's too heavy to lay down on the seedlings, but it lays on these wire boxes. And the same thing for winter. I protected my winter lettuce and spinach. I put a box like this down and laid plastic on top. So in fact, I ended up using these boxes out in the garden almost all year round without even having stored them and put them away. I don't think I have ever made a more useful gardening gizmo. It's only taken me, 3 or 4 decades to figure that out. And just a little warning, I don't see anything like this happening this week, but this was April 13th last year. So it's at my house. So, don't rush it. And this is last year, with the cold weather going till nearly the end of June, squash plants that I was growing, I did put some out, and they just are simply unable to get nutrients. Their cellular processes do not work in cold weather, and a cabbage can grow in the weather that these cannot grow in. And they just can't do it. So this plant was one of the ones I'd kept and was taking it into the greenhouse every night. And this is the same plants, same kind of plants that had been put outdoors, and it was awful for them. They quit, then rotted, the leaves died, some of the stems died. It was miserable. Don't rush your hot season plants, your warmth loving crops. Okay, so today I'm going to start with making use of small spaces, what to grow and how to, pack in as much as you can. And then I'll talk about containers. Then I think we'll probably have the break, and then we'll do the containers after the break, or we may get started on containers before the break. And then the greenhouses and tunnels will follow. So as you can imagine, if you have a small space, the most productive vegetables are going to be things that produce a lot all season without you having to replace the plants and plants that are small. So cut and come again greens are things like Swiss chard. You cut a leaf, it grows more. All season you cut leaves off, and it just grows more and more and more. An example that is not a cut and come again green would be head lettuce. You cut the head, it's gone. But leaf lettuce is a lot more like that. You can take leaves off of leaf lettuce for a long time before it is finished. And of course, small rooted plants, lettuce and radishes and scallion and corn salad, a lot of those can be planted in very small areas and be productive. There are bush versions of squash and cucumbers. This is a bush zucchini, and a lot of the zucchini plants now are bush. And you can see how many there's, it hasn't sprawled anywhere. There's no vine, but I can see 1, 2, 3 mature zucchini ready to pick, and a whole bunch of more. And they're all just coming out of the center of the plant. Extremely productive. There are bush cucumbers as well. You have to search a bit to find those. Bush tomatoes are very productive for small spaces. Those are the tomatoes. They're also called determinate tomatoes. They grow to a certain point and then they quit, which is different than the vining or indeterminate tomatoes, which are all tomatoes are perennials. And the indeterminate and vining tomatoes just keep producing new shoots with flowers and fruit, and new shoots and flowers and fruit. And if the weather didn't get cold, they would be 20 or 30 feet long. So bush tomatoes are easier to deal with, obviously, in a small space. And then plants that give you a really long harvest, like Swiss chard, but also things like pole beans. If you're going to go to the trouble of growing beans, you can actually grow quite a lot on pole bean trellises in a small area. I think, considerably more per square foot than you get on bush beans. And pole beans, they have a big crop and then it sort of tails off and then they have a whole flush of flowers and go again all through into the end of September. So the plants are don't have to be replaced. They're quite durable. So things like, you know, tomatoes and peppers, you don't replace those over the season. Those are also really good productive vegetables for small spaces. So I'm going to talk about succession planting and then just increasing the density of plantings, and interplanting and underplanting, which are a little bit different, and vertical cropping, which of course pole beans are as a perfect example of that. So I showed you this slide, I think in January when we were talking about garden planning. So a few of these slides are review. Planning for successive plantings for your annual crops is how to have good quality crops without any waste. So plant very small amounts of lettuce and radishes, Chinese cabbage at 2 or 3 week intervals. And the purpose of this is that you always have fresh, prime quality plants. If you put all your lettuce in the garden in the spring, you will be eating a lot of lettuce, but there'll come a point at which a lot of those plants won't probably be used. And they'll go to seed and they get bitter and things. So a little bit frequently in small spaces is one kind of succession. And also bush beans. Now I also do successive plantings of sweet corn. I plant 3 different batches because I don't want all my sweet corn arriving at once. Sweet corn varieties are remarkably uniform. If you put out 50 sweet corn plants all on the same day, you pretty much within a few days of each other will have 50 ears of corn to eat. So, you know, dividing that 50 or actually you don't want to go below 25 plants at a time because they won't get pollinated, but 25 plants and then 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, another 25 plants, those make good spacing so that you always have good, you know, good productive crops. And then the last type of succession is you putting in some of the crops for winter as the crops you've seeded in the spring or eaten in the summer are finished. And even zucchini can be planted in a succession. A lot of zucchini varieties are 45 to 50 days to harvest, which means that I always plant a couple zucchini really, really early. I have one in a pot that's getting huge at this point. But I also seed some on the 30th of June. And actually that worked out fine last year because it didn't even warm up to the 30th of June. But those are for harvest in August to November. I'm just going to ask everybody, just check that your microphones are off. I hear somebody in the background. So here's an example of the chart that again, you would have seen earlier. Sowing the winter crops as soon as the spring and summer crops are finished. If you can plant the next day or the same day as your garlic comes out, for example, and most garlic will be done in the middle of July. And some really early garlic is done by the 3rd week of June. But sometime after the 1st week of July, your garlic will be finished. And you can put in, if you remember that planting chart that I have, it's on the homepage of my website. You can print that out. That little planting chart, if you look at what can be planted in June and July, there's a lot of things. So when the garlic is finished, or when the spring peas, if you're planting peas now, those peas will be done in early July. They just turn brown. They're finished and you cut them down and plant something else. If you're growing onions from sets, they'll be done the 3rd week of July, and your main crop garlic will be done the 3rd week of July. But a lot of other things that we'd be seeding this month, Chinese cabbage, radishes, all sorts of things, even cauliflower. I have little cauliflower plants now, but they will be harvested, and that's it. Once you cut a cauliflower head, it's over. You can leave them sometimes in the ground for a long time and they'll produce 1 or 2 little side cauliflowers, but it takes quite a while to do it. So I tend not to wait for them to do anything. Once the head is harvested, I replace the plant with something else. So the succession can be, get those winter crops right in there after the spring and summer things are finished. And I thought I'd walk you through this example. I didn't put this example in the first set of slides on garden planting, but I thought it would be a little more illuminating if I kind of walk you through how it would work. This is the same bed, so it's just one bed we're looking at over a 2.5 year period. So we started out, so say last month I had sown lettuce and peas in this bed. Well, they're done in early July. This bed will be all ready for anything that you could plant in July, which includes our winter broccoli, our cauliflower, the overwintering ones. So I will have had March and peas, lettuce and peas. And then in the middle of the summer, I will put in broccoli and cauliflower, and they just stay there all winter. And they're making their heads now. They'll be done in May. Well, May is when the soil, we hope, is warming up. And now it's time, you could put any warm season crop in there. Tomatoes and peppers, for example, and eggplant and things like that. At the end of August, I can just gently lift up the plants a bit. I'm not going to take them out, obviously, and scatter seed on the soil underneath the tomato plants and pepper plants. So the seeds of really small winter greens that will grow quickly in September. So corn salad, lettuce, arugula, things like that. As October comes and the tomatoes and peppers are now finished, I'll cut them off, and that bed is going to just be full of salad greens all winter because it's already been sown to salad greens. Of course, those having been over the winter are going to be eaten, and they're going to go to seed in the spring. So by May, I will have pretty well used up all the salad, and the soil is warming up, and I could put in corn or squash or cucumbers. Any of those warm season crops will be done by the end of October. And that's when we plant garlic. So you can see this bed doesn't really need to have more than about 5 minutes without a crop in it. So you get the maximum use out of one small area. Another approach is just fill gaps as they arise. And I showed you a picture of bed that was a succession of crops, but it isn't usually as neat as that. Often there's just gaps, maybe something you harvested or something the dog jumped on and broke it, or something your family didn't like. So you'll have a gap in a bed. Be ready to fill that. You can have a little nursery of seedlings somewhere, then transplant in, or just sprinkle seeds wherever there's a gap. And the quick crops for those kinds of gaps are any kind of leafy green. Anything you could use in a salad grows so quickly that you can sprinkle seeds anywhere that there's room. Some of the root crops, now not carrots because they're so slow to germinate, but root crops like turnips and beets, they grow quite quickly, and you can eat them when they're very small as baby vegetables, baby beets. So they can be used as a quick catch crop in a gap. And these sweetheart cabbages, I really like these little cabbages. They are really sweet and mild, and they're not strong flavored at all, and they grow very quickly. So if you get halfway through the summer and don't really have any cabbage, you can quickly sow seeds and have cabbage by fall. And of course, radishes are, standby. They're 28 days usually from start to finish. And, even in the best planned garden, there's always gaps, because I don't know what it was here, probably lettuce and things that I ate, but there's a gap there, and I think there's a gap there. So, as you harvest the corn, every time you cut down a corn stalk, there's a gap right there that minute. And, you don't have to wait till the whole bed is harvested to plant something else. And that goes for all of it. If sometimes different varieties of onions, the rows of one variety are finished and another variety may not be done, but you can seed the row that's finished with something else. Now we can move on to densifying our planting. Now, kids, don't try this at home if it's a new garden. It takes a couple years to build up a really good available nutrient supply in the soil, as you add compost every year and have nutrients that are readily available to the roots. So as your soil gets more fertile, and I'm assuming you also have access to regular water, you can start making plantings more dense. And you can also, use liquid fertilizer. The module in the February module on soil, I talked about making a really cheap manure tea or compost, a shovel full of compost or manure in a bucket, and use that water to water your plants. So supplemental liquid fertilizer will certainly bail out a situation where the plants are don't have quite enough nutrients because they're a bit crowded. The other thing you can do is just be ready to thin the plants if it's not growing well. This are sweetheart cabbages that are growing interplanted with lettuce, and this was the day that I decided that the lettuce pretty much had to go because now the cabbage needs the spot. And that's the beauty of lettuce, is that you can eat it at any size. So as a densification, as a plant to make really dense use of your space, lettuce is quite ideal. And also when things are this densely planted, the plants themselves are shading the soil enough to control weeds. So, you don't really need rows in a raised bed. You're not going to ever walk on that bed. And since you're walking on the side here, you can use every square inch of the surface of a bed. And usually you can plant closer than seed packages or seed descriptions say. Sometimes the packages will say so many inches or centimeters apart in the row, but then they'll give you a spacing for the row. It could be like 18 inches, which is obviously allowing for a tractor or people to walk down the rows or something. And you don't need to allow for row spacing in a bed where you're not walking between the rows. So you can really cuddle things up. If you do this kind of offset planting called a quincux pattern, each plant will have the maximum amount of space for its own roots. And if you can get a hold of a piece of chicken wire, this is 2-inch chicken wire, or even a piece of stucco wire, the 2-inch wire anyway, and lay it down on the soil. This can be used as a template just to give you an idea of how closely you can plant things. This is perfect spacing for carrots, salad greens of all kinds, radishes, beets, one seed in each place or a couple seeds, and then thin them. And then once you've done this a few times, you'll get a much better feel for how spaced out and yet how close together you can plant. Because we really don't mean this. This is so close together that the seedlings are choking each other out, and they have to be thinned. Luckily, a huge amount of plant material that we grow is all good in salads. So just thin it and eat it when it's tender and small in salads. These plants here are spaced out fairly well, and there'll be another thinning to go through and space them out some more, but these are too dense. So I don't mean overcrowded when I mean dense. I mean ideally spaced nicely out like this. Just remember that we always have to thin beets and chard, because that thing that you plant is a little fruit. It's not a seed. There's several seeds inside that little shriveled up thing that you plant. So this was probably one seed, and maybe there was 2 seeds here. So you always have to thin them out. And you can transplant the extra seedlings to somewhere else if you want to. So you can increase the density just by more seeds per area. You can also do interplanting that makes the use of the space when the plants are small, and then as plants need the space, you can remove some of the crops. So the trick here is to find things that are compatible because their root zones don't compete, or they're compatible because, for example, this is broccoli. The yellow circles is sprouting broccoli, which gets huge and eventually needs that whole bed. But it takes a while for that to happen. And meanwhile, there's plenty of space for other plants before the broccoli needs that space. And the lettuce can grow in shady areas, so it's not going to be too unhappy if the broccoli gets tall very quickly. So what I've got here is broccoli and cauliflower interplanted with lettuce. The cauliflowers are going to come up, produce their head, and be cut off. And the broccoli will keep growing and eventually fill this whole bed in. And I will have long since eaten the lettuce. So I'll have 3 crops in a spacing for one crop. Other kinds, you'll see lettuce figures very highly in my interplant. Actually, I never plant lettuce in its own bed. There's no need to. It's such a good interplant. If you put in new strawberry plants this spring, it's going to take them a while to get their little leaves under them and their roots organized. And meanwhile, you can get a whole crop of lettuce in there without the strawberries even knowing that they needed the space. You can put lettuce in between winter brassicas. You can grow radishes and carrots. Sometimes it's not a bad idea to sprinkle a few radish seeds among your carrot seeds, just because the radish seed will come up in a few days and will show you where you were planting, and it will break the soil up sometimes. If you've got soil that's a bit compacted, radishes can break that up for those little tiny carrot seedlings. And here's an example of interplanting winter crops and summer crops. The summer crop is the cucumbers, and they've rambled all over the soil. They're spread out nicely. And I don't exactly know where the cucumber plants are in here, but they're on a nice spacing for cucumbers. But that has to allow some room for the vines. So in July, I put in, here's seedlings of Brussels sprouts, who are very much going to appreciate having the soil cooled for them with the vines running over the ground. And I do this every year because it does work so well. The final spacing here is what the Brussels sprouts would need when they'll be 4 feet high by the end of October. But at that point, the cucumbers are pretty well finished. So I did mention earlier, you could have a little nursery bed to make a tight schedule fit on any of these, whether it's interplanting or underplanting, is start a bed of seedlings and transplant them later. Now this is really something that we need to remember we can do when we get a cool summer. 2 years ago, we had a much cooler summer. And the timing of seeding in that planting chart that I provide is based on planting at the right time of year. And if you plant too late, you won't get the crop. And if it's a cool season, there's no space for them, and suddenly you're jammed up. But you can still start your seeds on time. You could put them in a seedling flat somewhere, or you can make a little nursery bed where you start a lot of different things and then just move them into the spaces as the spaces open up. So you still actually start things on time. There's kale here and Chinese cabbage and komatsuna. All of these things are too dense to stay here, but they're for transplanting. Now, I am going to just show you an interplanting example. The pictures are not great because I didn't think to start taking the pictures till halfway through the cycle. But I'll just show you the dynamic process here. This is one bed in my front yard that is 6 feet. It's about 6 feet wide and has a path down the middle. And this is about 10 feet. You can see there's an artichoke here. So this little piece of bed here has a small bed in front and a small bed in back. And the bed in the back half had peas, and there's still some peas there, but I had quite densely planted to peas, and it had lettuce in the foreground. Now, this is obviously the end of June, this picture. But in May, I planted broccoli and cauliflower in that pattern I just showed you with the sprouting broccoli with the little cauliflower plants in between, harvesting the cauliflower when it was done and leaving the rest of the bed to the broccoli. And then in June, as the lettuce is pretty well finished here in the front, I put in Brussels sprout seedlings. And when the lettuce was done, I interplanted, I put in cucumber plants and then Brussels sprout seedlings. Then remove the peas in the back are completely finished and the cauliflower is gone. So we just have broccoli in the back. So what we have now for the rest of the summer is broccoli in the back, huge plants. And in the foreground, we have a bed of cucumbers with Brussels sprouts growing in them. By the end of the summer, the cucumbers are finished, and this whole bed, I'm looking at it from another angle, this is the pathway, is brassicas. It's cabbage family. So there's the broccoli again. here are the Brussels sprouts that are now getting up to be full-sized. So what I've grown in this bed was peas, lettuce, cucumbers, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and cauliflower. Now, for the purposes of crop rotation, what should I worry about here? It's a brassica bed, really, because we don't have to worry about rotating cucumbers, lettuce, or peas. So they're of no concern in terms of planning for next year. So all I have to remember for the coming season is that I grew the brassicas in this bed last year, so I could grow all kinds of other things, but I won't be putting in cabbage family. There's a underplanting is another technique, which is a little bit different than interplanting in that we're starting a crop before another crop is finished. Growers call this relay planting too, where they'll have a crop in the field and they'll underplant something that will still be there after the first crop is harvested. So in late August, this is the example I gave you of lifting up the vines of tomatoes or peppers or squash or cucumbers. You just lift them up off the soil enough to pull the mulch back and seed on the surface of the soil small hardy greens. And late August works fine. Then when this, you can see this is late in the season because there's some powdery mildew on the squash leaves. Then late at the end of the season, the squash is done. I cut off the plants because I don't want to disturb the roots of the seedlings growing, and haul the big old dead plants off to the compost or somewhere. And that's what I have is a squash bed. There was probably a squash plant here, but by the time you harvest it and get your warm season crop off the bed, the ground is covered with greens. So that's a relay cropping or underplanting. Well, any questions about the vegetables so far? I'm going to talk about growing fruit in small spaces in a moment, but I'm kind of charging through this material, but any questions? You can put your little yellow hand up, or if you can't figure that out, just unmute yourself and ask your question. All right, well, I guess nobody's got a question. Okay, well, what about fruit in small spaces? Well, if you've ever seen a standard old apple tree, one of the heritage trees that's around, they're absolutely enormous. If you've ever seen how big a fig tree can grow if it's left to its own devices, they can go 30 feet tall. So they're not easy to keep in a small space, but we do have options, and we do have a lot of fruit that we can use in pretty small spaces. One is to go for dwarf fruit trees. And there even are super dwarfing trees on what's called M27 rootstock, which are other lovely trees. I planted some years ago, and they only get about 8 feet high, and they're just so productive. I'm really amazed. But there are options for regular, like that's apples. The M27 is apples, and dwarf trees generally are between 12 and 15 feet high. If you get a fruit tree that has several varieties grafted on it, then for the kinds of trees that need a cross-pollinator, you don't have to have a second tree because you've actually got a branch on your tree that is the cross-pollinator. So if you get an apple variety with 3 varieties on the tree, then you only have to have 1 apple tree. I have quite a large dwarf plum, and it has 3 varieties on it. One's an early, one's a middle, and one's a late plum. And I have about 2.5 months of fresh plums from that tree because and I only just have to have 1 tree. So there's some really good options there. If you've got enough space for 1 tree, you can grow a dwarf tree with several different varieties on it. There are genetic dwarfs, peaches and nectarines. They're quite small trees, and I'll show you a picture of one in a moment they're the kind of trees you could grow in a container. But they're really small. They're 1 meter high, maybe 3 or 4 feet. And then the other thing is we can grow grapes. And Isaiah kiwi, which is a hardy kiwi. These are small fruit compared to the New Zealand kiwis, but they taste the same. They're about the size of the end of my thumb, the first joint of a thumb. And they have a smooth skin, so you don't have to peel the skin off. You eat the whole thing. It's kind of like a kiwi grape. And they are quite productive and much smaller vines than the big New Zealand kiwi vines, which are enormous. But both grapes and this kiwi can be grown up a fence or a wall, and they're pretty compatible with a garden on one side of the fence. So your fence for your garden can support these fruit. And raspberries, bush raspberries for very small spaces work quite well. And I'll talk about strawberries in a minute. Probably strawberries are the best fruit for small space, but I'll check in with those in a minute. When we're still talking about fruit trees, just be sure that you know whether cross-pollination is required. If you are growing one apple tree, you need another variety. And unfortunately, there are some varieties that the pollen, like Gravenstein and Jonagold, the pollen will not pollinate other trees. So if you want to grow a Gravenstein tree, you need 3 apples or 3 branches on the same tree that are different apples. So apples and pears, it's the same situation. You need at least 2 different varieties. And cherries and plums, there are self-fertile ones and there are ones that require cross-pollination. So if you've only got room for one tree, then do some homework and figure out which varieties you can grow without having a cross-pollinator, or get a tree that has several grafted on the one tree. A pollinizer is a variety that has compatible pollen. And like I say, Gravenstein, Mutsu, Jonagold, they're not pollinizers for any other apples. They're great apples, but they have to have pollen from somewhere else. In small spaces, fruit easy to pollinate is really important. It's not necessarily just because it's small, but just because we have such unpredictable spring weather when the trees are blooming. If it's really cold and rainy that week, or windy in the week or two, the flowers are only on the really prime on the tree for about a week to 10 days at the most. And if the bad weather occurs when the only fruit period is, then the trees may not get pollinated. So choose fruit that's easy to pollinate, including by hand, because you might have to go around with a paintbrush and do some pollinating. And if you've got self-fertile varieties, you just have to move the pollen within the flower. If they have to be cross-pollinated, you have to go back and forth between trees or branches. So again, multi-graft trees. And this is where berries are really shine, is because they bloom later and a lot longer. And depending what kind of berry it is, for example, strawberries, you can get everbearing day neutral strawberries that bloom all summer. Excuse me. So anyway, berries in general give you a much better chance of good weather for fruit set. And some of them don't even really need pollinators, like strawberries and these red currants that are in the pictures here. They can set a perfectly good crop without pollinators. Grapes set an excellent crop. They don't need pollinators because they're wind or vibration pollinated. And figs, the fruit's completely closed. So they don't need to be pollinated, but then they get enormous. So figs are not a thing to try and keep in a very small area. So strawberries, the everbearing and day neutral berries are not exactly the same thing, but in our climate, it pretty much comes to the same thing. Everbearing strawberries have a crop and then a bit of a lull, and then they have another crop. True day neutral strawberries pretty much just bloom and fruit all season, but our season isn't that long. And so frankly, it's a distinction without a difference. So either day neutral or everbearing varieties will give us crops into September, picking into September. So, you know, TriStar, Albion, Quinault, those are everbearing. The June-bearing strawberries produce quite a lot in a very short period of time, and then that's it. Then they're just using garden space till next year. So there is an argument for you planting them though, because ever since we have this pest called the spotted wing Drosophila, it's been with us now about 8 or 9 years. Ever since that showed up, it has made it harder to have these later crops unless you cover them with insect netting. So the June-bearing strawberries usually produce their crop before there's enough spotted wing Drosophila around to be much of a problem. So that's about the only argument I can see in favor of June-bearing strawberries. But it's a good argument. Okay, so growing vertically to save space. This is just we're back to vegetables again. We're now on the vertical ideas. Training things up trellises, which of course we would do with pole beans and peas. You can get a lot into a small space if that plant is not going to sprawl on the ground. And indeterminate tomatoes, the vining types, if they're well controlled and can be staked up really well or trellised up on strings, they don't take up very much space because it's all vertical space. And in cucumbers, I showed you pictures of my cucumbers sprawling around on the ground, but I could have also trellised them up. Cucumbers and melons can be run onto frames of various sorts or up strings. The fruit can rip the vines off. The weight of the fruit can pull the vines off the trellis. So you really need to put little slings under the melons, for example, little hammocks or kerchiefs tied to the trellis once the fruit starts to form, just so that the wind doesn't cause the fruit to rip themselves off their trellis. And when it comes to fruit, this is another view of the hardy kiwi. It's a delicate vine, actually. It's quite pretty as an ornamental vine. This is growing on my fence. And this is showing grapes growing as a garden on a garden fence. It's interesting because grapes have quite deep roots, and the roots there's sort of a whorl of roots, and then it goes down really deep, and then there's another whorl of roots. And they seem to really stay out of trouble with garden crops near them. Whereas if a fruit tree was planted here, the fruit tree roots would be way out into the soil here. There'd be a big circle of area that would be affected by the roots of the tree. But grapes, this doesn't seem to happen. I've got 22-year-old grapes along one side of my garden, and I plant I have about a foot difference between the grapevine and the edge of the vegetable bed. And I never see any difference. And yet the end of that bed is near a fruit tree, and you can see very clearly where the fruit tree roots quit bothering the vegetables. And it's a much larger zone of interference. You can grow brambleberries, things like blackberry, yostaberry, raspberries. You can grow them on fences too, but they're a lot harder, and that trellises them up, but it's a lot harder to make them stay where they're put. They will send up a lot of shoots out into the bed, and you have to be right on top of them every year, removing any surplus shoots or any runners that go sideways, because they pretty rapidly will spread sideways. Now, espaliering the fruit trees that would ordinarily, that you might have as a freestanding tree, is a way to have them take up considerably less room. What you're doing is making it sort of a two-dimensional tree instead of three-dimensional. So if you go up against a wall or a fence and remove the branches that would be sort of sticking out at us in the picture here, you can save space. Now, there's still going to be a root zone here that's going to go out into the garden to some extent, but you will prevent the tree from shading anything because it'll be up against a wall. But I would just warn you that although this peach tree has been a lovely job of espalier, it's been planted too close to a house. You should never plant so close that you will have the roots interfere with the perimeter drains on your foundation. So had the peach tree been out here, you could trellis it into that house. It would have been better. Cinda, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I just had a question about is it Isaiah hardy kiwi?
Yeah, I don't know how to say it. It's I don't know if it's Issei or Issei.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway,
Yeah, the kiwi, I know the one you mean though.
Yeah, so you said it's a dwarf variety, is that right?
No, it's a different species than the New Zealand one, but it tastes the same.
So what I was wondering is, because we looked into getting a kiwi tree a few years ago, but we were told we'd have to get a male and a female.
Yes.
And that they would be huge.
Yes, that's the New Zealand kiwi. That's
So
the one
this
that's sort of
one-
egg size that you see in the grocery store.
Yes, yes.
But these Isaias are self-fertile.
Okay, great.
You
Okay.
don't have a male and a female. Now, the only problem that some people have had trouble with
Whatever. Yes.
because it can take them a while to fruit. It can take six
Okay.
years or more for them to start fruiting. About the time you panic and say, that's it, you're on waivers, you're out of here, suddenly it's fruit. I get a nice crop every year on mine now, but I've heard people say that they aren't that happy with them. I think they're great because I simply don't have anything like the space or interest in dealing with an enormous, vigorous pair of plants like the New Zealand kiwis.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
But they're a lovely option. They taste the same, and every year I make kiwi chutney out of the kiwi chutney recipe. I love it. So it's a good crop.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'll just show you, though, a perfect espalier, the Royal Horticultural Society garden in England. You can see how beautifully this tree was actually on wires, but it was very carefully trellised here. And it's quite an old tree, very productive. There was fruit every 6 inches along this whole thing. It wasn't ripe yet. So you can save space with espaliers. But here's the big drawback, especially in our climate. If you let that bark rub on anything, the chances of getting fungal diseases in apples and pears and bacterial diseases in peaches and nectarines and cherries is very high. We have 2 canker diseases here that are quite common, and whenever the bark is compromised somehow, usually by rubbing on something, then it can let in these pathogens. And you can see this big kind of pink canker that's on this branch. Everything past the branch is going to die. In this case, it's a canker on the trunk. So it's a slow death, but it is a death for the tree. So I don't like espaliers because of this in this climate. I've just seen too many trees like this. But of course, the experts that did this probably had they were pretty careful. It's just being extremely careful with how you tie in the tree and making sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. Actually, we have plenty of time, so I'm going to ask for questions right now about intensive growing. Before I go doing the vegetables and containers, I think we'll do questions and we'll take our break and we'll start the container module after the break. Oops, she said, pushing this thing. So have we got any questions about intensive growing in the garden or high density or?
Linda, I have a question.
Sure.
So at my local garden place, they're now offering trees that are not just 3 varieties, but 3 different types of fruit on the same.
Oh, yes, that would be
stock.
the plum, the plum, cherry, plum cot, those kinds of things. Those are
Yeah.
compatible grafts. You
Okay,
can put apples on those trees. You can only put the related type of fruit on those trees. They
okay,
sell them as fruit salad trees.
yeah,
Yeah.
but they work, do they?
Yes.
Sort of.
Yes, well, things like peaches are self-fertile, and as long as they have a self-fertile variety of a cherry or a plum, what's on what have you bought one?
No, I was afraid to because they're not cheap, eh? So,
No, they're very expensive. The problem is that if you, and this happens with all multi-graft trees, you might have 3 varieties of 3 things on there that you want, you just love them. Or maybe one is your favorite and it might not make it because all the grafts don't make it.
okay.
Over time, some grafts overgrow. My plum tree, the early plums and the middle plums are far more vigorous than the late plum variety. And the late plums kind of hanging in there, but the big production is on the 2 other varieties on that tree, no matter how I pruned it. So you have to be prepared for the fact that things can go a bit awry.
Yeah,
And if you lose something, if you had a mix and it was the cherry that you wanted more than anything else and it was the one that didn't make it, then that can be pretty annoying.
yeah.
So, but other than that, no, sure, they're compatible. The grafted material is compatible with the trunk. So
Okay, thanks.
yeah. Anybody else have a question? Okay, well, if not, let's come back in 10 minutes and we'll resume with containers. Oh, Joe, have you got a question?
Yeah, sorry. I was slow to the draw there. I just had a question about asparagus. Is it too late to plant the crowns out if we've ordered the asparagus?
Oh, no, no, not at all. It's probably just about the right time. If you, it can get too late at the end of May. The crowns that you buy in the
Okay.
store are usually pretty dried out. But it depends. Sometimes the nurseries pot them up into pots and you could plant them anytime you could get a hold of the ones that are potted. So if you've got, did
Okay,
you buy your
perfect.
crowns already?
Well, I was looking at the West Coast Seeds. They had them on pre-order like a
Mhm.
long time ago. And then I've had them in my cart a few times, and then I keep checking to make sure they're still available. And I haven't checked, I guess, for a few days now. But I just wondered if I sort
Oh,
of
no,
missed
it's
the
not at
boat on
all
it.
too
But
late.
it,
No.
yeah, that was kind of my feeling. Is it hasn't really gotten, warm. So okay,
No,
good.
no, not at all. In fact, the nurseries probably are just barely bringing in the crowns right now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
thank you.
there's plenty of time. Good. All right.
I'm
Okay,
sorry, Linda.
so
I
let's take a 10-minute break now, and we'll come back at, 18 till, and we'll see you then. And like I say, I'll be back in a moment anyway, if anybody does come up with a question for the break. I'm just going to pause the recording. Resume. Okay. Well, at the break, we were talking about, growing peppers in pots or growing peppers in the ground in a greenhouse. I'll tell you right now, it's quite possible to grow all kinds of things in containers, but it is easier to grow things in the ground. So there's some good reasons for growing things in containers. One is space. And even if you have a vegetable garden, you may still want to put some vegetables in containers to, say, put them in the hot spot on the deck to grow something like tomatoes if you don't have a really good spot in the garden. So there's a rationale for possibly growing vegetables in containers, even if you have vegetables in the ground. But it is always going to be, it require more management to have a good crop in a container. So the challenge is, because we have this smaller root area, it's so soil fertility and managing compaction, it gets compacted easily and the plants use up the nutrients quickly. We also water it a lot more frequently, so keeping things watered well can be an issue. And the fact that we're watering a lot will also leach out nutrients. So there's a nutrient management issue, there's moisture issue, and then whether it's hot or cold, it's hard on the roots compared to the tops. Obviously, tops of plants, all the foliage and everything is much more adapted to higher and lower temperatures than roots are, which are adapted to live in a zone where there isn't that big of a difference between, well, there's no difference really between day and night, and there's not much of a seasonal difference. So things suffer in a pot in hot weather or in cold weather that would not be suffering if they were growing in a garden. So the best bet for containers are obviously, again, small plants or plants that, like this pepper. Now here's an example of a friend of mine who has a lovely garden in beds, but she grows her peppers in big pots because they do really well and she can set them right up in the hottest part of the garden. So the best bets are things like the determinate tomatoes. The peppers and eggplants do fine. The small rooted things like lettuce and salad greens will be happier in the confined space of a pot. The cut and come again, or the things that produce the whole season, like Swiss chard and kale, they're quite useful. They can be done in pots, and all the herbs do really well in pots. Rosemary and thyme and parsley. You could grow bush varieties of cucumbers and squash in very large pots. Things that really don't work in pots at all are things like sweet corn and the big tomatoes, the vining tomatoes. You could trellis them up, but then you get a very top-heavy situation. So you have a plant that will need a lot of support to keep it up off that pot. It's possible, but it's tricky. And winter squash, most varieties run long vines, and that's again tricky in a pot. Not impossible. I guess the only one on that list that's really impossible is sweet corn. And that's because you need about 20 or 25 plants to get the pollination on corn. And you just, that would be quite a lot of pots all jammed together. So if you grow salad greens in a pot, you can do it a couple ways. You can just put in lots and lots of seeds and then cut it and let it grow back again, and cut it and let it grow back again, which is the same as the mesclun mixes that you see for growing out in the garden. Or you can have fewer plants and let them grow to a full size and harvest, and then feed the soil again with more compost and replant. So you would get several crops a year from one container, no matter how you managed it. But they're not going to grow to full size. These are meant to be just cut right off. You would not get a whole head of lettuce here on each of these lettuces. You would get a mix that you can keep cutting. Herbs do really well. They've small plants, small. They actually, a lot of them are from Mediterranean climates, so even the heat on the pot isn't a problem for them like it is for some of the vegetables. They do basil. Basil loves to be warm and dry. Rosemary, thyme, a lot of things do really well in containers. And I'm just promoting sweet potatoes. They're really easy to grow if you can get a plant from somewhere. And some of the nurseries will have the plants this spring. Dinter's often does have plants. I haven't seen them on Salt Spring. Most of the people on Salt Spring I know that are growing their yams started them in January or February to get little rooted offshoots off of a tuber. So it's too late to start that now, but if you can get a plant in a nursery, you just grow one plant in one big pot. And this is the only vegetable I know of that really likes the sun to be shining on the pot. They wish they were in Georgia, so drag them up along the house foundation. This picture here, they're in the back of my greenhouse, but they do quite well out of a greenhouse lined up where the sun shines straight on the pot. But anyway, despite that, anything can actually be grown in a pot if you really want to grow it. I don't think I would waste space putting carrots in a pot, but if that's the only space you have, you could grow carrots in a pot if you really needed to, or a cauliflower. But you'll notice that in a lot of these pictures, there's not very many plants in each pot. This is definitely not like growing flowers in a hanging basket where you cram in lots of little flowers and they fill in the space completely and they flow out of the plot. This is not what we're doing for vegetables. So what kind of containers we'll start with choosing containers. The weight of the container matters depending, if you're going to put it on a patio, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to put it on a balcony or a deck, or some people put them on rooftops, then the weight of the container and the soil and the whole thing is going to be extremely important. I like these ceramic pots, but when I'm growing things in pots, they can sit on my patio on the stones, so the weight isn't a consideration. If you're finding it difficult to handle the heavy pot full of soil with a plant, what I do is put a plastic pot inside the ceramic pot. So the soil is in the plastic pot. So when I need to say this is a lime tree, when I need to change the soil on the lime tree, I can just lift the plastic pot out, which is considerably less weight than trying to take that plus the ceramic pot at the same time. So for patios or where the weight itself doesn't matter, try and get the containers as big as you can. Any size that works for you is fine, but the bigger the better. Because the more root space they have, the easier it is to provide the good growing conditions, less problems with temperature being extreme on the roots, and there's simply the soil holds more water. Ideally, you would not have less than a foot of soil or 30 centimeters of soil. That's things like strawberries and lettuce can manage with that. But ideally, you have more than that. This is, I think, almost, I don't think it's quite 2 feet deep, but these are all quite deep. These galvanized stock tanks, it's 2 feet. It's an excellent depth. So I would, a foot is a real minimum, and it's much better to be getting over 1.5 feet to 2 feet of soil. As far as materials go, plastic is really lightweight, and if you've got plants out in the winter, it's not going to split in freezing weather, or usually it doesn't. And some of the pots can be recycled. And I hate to recommend buying new plastic, because I think we've really got to be getting ourselves weaned off of the use of plastic. But there's a lot of recycled pots around that are going to be around for a long, long time. So grabbing recycled plastic pots is as good an option as any. But there are alternatives to plastic, and one of them, and I know you've seen these around, these look like just heavy brown cardboard. It's compressed wood fiber, and you can actually buy compressed coconut fiber pots as well. And I'm surprised how long these last. The very, very bottom often comes out of them, but the whole pot itself lasts for quite a few years. I've been quite amazed. And obviously that can be composted once it really comes apart. Wood is frost proof, and it's not as heavy as ceramic, but it will rot eventually. Ceramic pots obviously look really nice and they last a long time, but they are heavy and they can break if they're out in the wintertime. Even if it's a glazed pot that shouldn't be absorbing water, if the root ball freezes, it can still break the pot apart. And then obviously the galvanized livestock troughs, which are becoming quite popular, that's this. They don't have most of these problems. They're pretty pricey, but they're pretty much a forever pot, container. Most of the time you'll have to drill the holes in the bottoms. Sometimes I've heard that some nurseries have had them available. My sister found some in Washington State where she lives. They had already drilled holes in the bottom of the containers. So you do have to do a little bit of retrofitting when you buy a stock tank. The window box size planter, they're designed for flowers. They're just really too small for vegetables, except for lettuce and herbs. This little planter here has basil and looks like parsley in it. That can work fine. Lettuce can be managed fine. This is a planter, custom planter here on Salt Spring. It's actually about 3 times bigger than this, with red cabbage growing in it. So, you could have a window box, but maybe you need to build it with a bigger volume of roots for vegetables. There's an option with quite low cost compared to all of these planters that I've just showed you, is bags. I mean, even 2 black garbage bags, one inside the other, will get you through a season of growing potatoes in a bag. Obviously, you can collapse them and store them. And, if you're renting somewhere and you want to invest in some burlap bags or a few things, you can just fold them up and move away. So they're pretty flexible in that way. There is the same problem as with any potted plant. The sun getting on the roots here can be pretty hot, but you can shade that. You can shade that planter. So it's another way to go. These are freestanding bags from Lee Valley Tools, but again, they're a lot of options. I mean, here we have somebody just growing in old compost bags and cardboard boxes. Doesn't look particularly ornamental, but the potatoes don't care. So if it's got a hole in the top, you could probably grow some plants in it. But what about vegetables in hanging containers? Well, it's a problem of, again, these vegetables are not like hanging baskets of flowers. You can't get a lot of plants into the small area, and the ones you do have to be quite small. If they're tomatoes, they're going to have to be very small fruit, or else they'll just break the branches over they'll extend over the edge of the planter and just break them from the weight of a ripening tomato. So cherry tomatoes and the really little peppers, that will work. Anytime, you have this small of a volume of soil up in the air like this, it's going to need a lot of water quite frequently. And in fact, on a really hot, windy summer day, it could be 2 or 3 times in one day that they would require water. So that is a consideration. And I don't know if any of you remember the upside down tomato fad. That was quite funny. It was about 10 years ago. You know, you're supposed to, this is soil in the pot, the plant's growing out of a hole in the bottom, and you had to water from here, which was like, you know, then the water ran out onto the vines, and which was just like a recipe for late blight. But also people discovered pretty fast that any tomatoes of any size in here, the branches break as soon as the fruit is setting. So bit of a, you know, when you see a fad like this, just scratch your head and just think really hard about what might not actually work. I noticed after a few years of this, then you could buy these hanging pots for 99 cents on sale at every garden center because they were trying to get rid of them. So it's important that containers have good drainage. And 2 or 3 drainage holes, and you know, in these big, you know, in a 5-gallon pot, but you know, the larger planters should have very generous amount of drainage holes. I actually like the pots that have the hole carved into the side here, as opposed to just a circle in the bottom of the pot. The ones, and often the pottery ones, the ceramic ones, just have one hole in the bottom of the pot. That can be clogged up with roots. And if the pot is sitting right down on that one single hole right in the bottom and it's clogged up with roots, it just plugs up the hole. Or these sideways holes, it flows a little better. You can raise the pots up enough that you don't get that effect of kind of sealing the pot down to the surface by pot feet or little pebbles. You just need 3 of anything, 3 little pebbles, 3 little blocks of wood, and it'll prop the pot up within a saucer and it won't tip. And that allows drainage. It helps drainage. If your pots are on a deck, well, if they're on especially on a balcony or an apartment balcony or something, the overflow water, where is that going to go is a consideration. You might need big saucers under everything to prevent it from flowing or staining, you know, going somewhere you don't want it, like the people below you, or staining decks, flowing out and wrecking a deck treatment. So here's pot feet you can buy, but like I say, you don't need to buy them necessarily. 3 little pebbles will do perfectly well. It makes a very stable, it holds them up, they're quite stable. Something you might want to consider though are some of these big saucers, and they're again on raised little feet. This keeps the pot from staining and making a circle on patio stones or decks. Just having a pot in the same place all season will make a ring on a deck and stain it. So having them up off the deck a little bit will prevent that. Now you'll notice here, I've just noticed this, these pots are up, there's little feet under all of these pots. They're quite well designed. So where to put containers? Well, they need full sun. It's the same as anything. And wherever the weight isn't going to be an issue. You know, this is a sturdy deck, and these pots are not going to exceed the weight allowance of this deck. And where the water flows here is not going to be an issue. One of the advantages of plants in pots is that you can shift them around a bit. I mean, you're not going to want to do it on a daily basis, but you know, as the season changes, or perhaps the shade is, you know, comes in on a certain area of the garden for part of the summer, you can move the pots if you need to maximize their sun exposure. These tomatoes are being planted. There's a deck that comes right out to the edge here above this, a balcony, I guess. And that is keeping the rain off the tomatoes. So they're lined up here where they get the maximum sun, but they actually have a cover that's protecting them from rain. So on decks, or certainly on balconies, if weight's a consideration, it obviously depends on how the thing has been built. Big pots the weight can be spread out by being put on pallets, or just put the heavy pots where the support posts are for the deck. So really consider that. It can actually be quite damaging to put pots too close to, fragile flashing in the construction of the building. This is a common place. This was actually being repaired here. The flashing on an apartment house, this is up against the wall. There's a flashing joint here. And if you set a pot right on the heavy weight of a pot, right against that back wall on the apartment deck, and I'll show you, it would be back in here somewhere. The weight pulling down can compromise that joint. And here we are having a repair being done. So containers should always be at least a foot away from the walls, any walls. And also, if it's a roof, they should be a foot away from the edge of the roof, because if it's a flat roof, it'll have a similar kind of flashing, and that can be compromised by heavy pots. So protect this joint, this flashing joint. You don't want leaks. So obviously in this kind of situation, lightweight containers and growing mixes that don't weigh very much, which I'll talk about in a minute, this would be what we would need here. And just be really careful. It's so easy to add some more pots and then some more pots and then some hanging baskets. And then before you know it, it may exceed the design weight for an apartment deck that was never built to, sustain the weight. Soil mixes for things in containers. Okay, so we've got this limited root room, limited volume of soil, so it's really got to be fertile soil. So where the weight of the container is not a problem, such as on a patio or something like that, or sitting in the greenhouse, equal parts of sand and peat moss or coir, which is the coconut fiber, good garden soil, and best compost. And I mean compost like sea soil or Ole Mountain or something like that, that is really good quality compost. So 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. The sand's quite heavy, but it's going to allow for drainage. And the compost, we need at least 25% compost in that pot to provide the nutrients. Now, if the soil, if you don't want the pot to weigh as much, it may be a place where it can't be heavy, or maybe it's just hard on your back to lift pots that are too heavy. Then skip the sand, which is extremely heavy, and use something like perlite or vermiculite instead, because that is going to have the same function. It's going to do the same thing, but they will weigh virtually nothing. So we're still going to have the peat moss or coir. It's still the best compost and the potting soil, but one portion, 1/4 of the mix will be perlite or vermiculite. I just have to warn you, they've gotten really expensive, those two ingredients. Well, actually, I'm not sure about perlite, but vermiculite, whew, I have stopped buying vermiculite for any reason. Now, for places where you need the lightest weight of a container, it might be a window box or something sitting on a balcony, then we're going to skip the soil as well, because soil is pretty heavy. So sand and soil. Instead of that, we'll use peat moss and perlite and vermiculite and just a lot of good compost. And so in this case, it's 1/3 peat moss or coir, 1/3 perlite and vermiculite, and 1/3 compost. So that's a pretty lightweight, it's basically a soilless mix. Now, to all of these, we're going to add complete organic fertilizer. So roughly 1/4 cup to 2 gallons of soil and lime, unless your soil is really, really not acidic at all. But most of us have soil that needs lime, and that it's a small amount. It's a tablespoon per 2 gallons of soil. So that'd be your recipe if you're mixing up container mixes in a wheelbarrow or in a big bucket. That is, these are workable recipes. You can buy soil as well, and soilless mixes. And if you have to, have a lightweight mix, you may be just as good off buying them already mixed up and it saves you the hassle of buying all the separate ingredients and the fertilizer and mixing the whole thing. You just can take it straight out of the bag. And this is the lightest weight option, but basically they're peat and vermiculite. But read the labels, because some of these products have nutrients and some don't. And what you want is one with nutrients in it. Now, if you happen to read the label of something you've got right now, and it just says peat and vermiculite, then add compost to it. Don't, I mean, you can use the product, but you're going to have to mix in the fertilizer and the compost. So go back to this recipe and add these ingredients. So, check the bag. Usually if it's a planting mix, it contains the nutrients, and it might say on the bag, it might have language like sufficient, for good seedlings, or, for total growth. So it really specifically mentions that there's nutrients in the mix. And potting soil usually doesn't have anything but just the peat, vermiculite, or coir. It's meant to be used for house plants, for example, where you periodically are going to put some fertilizer in the water and water the plants. So, and now also, if you're using these mixes, commercial mix, if you can, put a little bit of good garden soil in there. It's just enough to inoculate the bag with microbes. It's not a bad idea. I'm not talking about a lot of soil to make the mix heavy, but it does actually, it's like making yogurt. It's like a little bit of yogurt starter in there. Despite how much compost and complete organic fertilizer you've put in your mix, you still need to be prepared to start liquid feeding sometime in the summer. The initial growth from the nutrients that are in the soil will probably carry the plants along for a while. Usually it's sort of in June or something, certainly by July, you'll need to start fertilizing weekly or monthly. And that's a liquid fertilizer in addition to whatever's already in your soil. And that's just because of the small root space, and veggies need a lot of food. And also because you will have been having to water so much more often that it's leaching the nutrients out. So go back and look at the module number 2 if you want, about making a homemade compost tea, or you can buy concentrated fertilizers, organic fertilizer, and mix it in water. But you will need to put your container vegetables on some kind of supplementary feeding schedule, usually halfway through the summer at least. So how many plants in a container? Well, again, this is not like flowers in a little hanging basket with lovely little, tumbling flowers. This is 1 plant per pot for a lot of the plants. So in a 1 gallon pot, you could put 1 really small pepper plant, 1 little cherry tomato, and 5 or 10 lettuce plants. And these are not, the lettuce plants you're just going to cut them off. You won't be growing full heads of lettuce here. And even up to a 2 gallon pot, we're still talking about a small tomato plant. This actually is a 2 gallon pot here for this somewhat larger pepper. So here we have 1 gallon pots, lots of really teeny little ornamental peppers being grown here. But you can see that down here, where there are larger plants, peppers and things in this greenhouse, they're larger pots, but there's still only 1 plant per pot. And this is probably about a 3 gallon pot. There's 1 cucumber. This is 3 or 4 gallon pots, one large tomato. And again, these are my sweet potato pots, one plant, 1 potato in a potato bag, 1 sweet potato in a big planter. When you're watering containers, obviously the hotter it is and the drier it is and the windier it is, it's just like plants anywhere. They're going to suck up a lot more water more quickly. And so you'll have to speed up the frequency of watering. And because the roots don't tolerate as much heat as the foliage, you might need to shade the pot. And this person has actually put white around there. And I've seen people put foil, but she's shading it with this, or drag the pot somewhere, where the top of the plant's in the full sun and the roots aren't even in the sun. There's no good reason to have sun on a pot. If you can organize it so the sun is not on the pot, the plants will actually do a lot better over the summer. The only exception is sweet potatoes. They want their pots to cook, but everybody else would be a lot better off with more moderate temperatures in the soil, especially if you're doing potatoes in bags. And we were talking about this as if people were coming on tonight. potatoes in bags works really well, but it can be too hot. And that's the caveat. If you can shade those bags or put the bags behind some planters so that the sun is actually not on the bag directly, just on the foliage, that works really well. And check each pot to water. There can be pretty big differences, even though it's the same size pot and soil and everything, and one tomato in each pot. The individual plants can have, quite different amounts of water that they draw from the soil. I think this person actually has a drip system on these plants. So if you're hand watering, you may need to do it. Well, you'll have to do it once a day at least, and often twice a day. And actually, depending on how big the pot is, be prepared for watering 3 times a day in a heat wave. In fact, I think I probably should put a slide in here. When it comes to a heat wave, if you've got things in pots, if you can drag them into the shade, they're going to be so much more likely to survive. A few days in the shade will not be nearly as hard on them as spending some time out in the sun. So if they're in the shade, they'll just grow slowly, but they'll survive. They're highly at risk of being killed out in direct sun in high temperatures. So hand watering, just, be on top of that. Automatic drip systems, they're delightful, but they're not cheap. It's expensive to wire up all those pots, but on the other hand, you can have them just run for 1 or 2 minutes, once or twice or 3 times a day, and have really good results from the plant's point of view. I wanted to show you this little shrubler fitting. I've actually, this is a little, it's got 5 little openings on it, and the water comes out. I've just drawn it here because I don't have a photo of the water coming out. It just comes out in 5 gentle little trickles, kind of just, well out, and you can change how far the water goes by screwing in the fitting. And the tighter you screw it in, the less distance the water goes. And these are quite good for watering pots because it distributes the water widely and gently, so it soaks in. They're trickles, really. There are other things you can do. There's, expensive little glass bulbs. You can fill them with water and point them down, or cheaper plastic ones that you can bury right into an individual pot. This is like kind of like a miniature version of an Ola, which is a large pottery pot buried in the soil. This is the same thing exactly. This is a bulb of water with little holes in it. It's just wicking out into the soil around the plant. So you can go away for the weekend and water plants this way. And then here's the poor man's excuse, which is the pot bottles upside down. Works beautifully, actually. Cut the bottoms out of big containers, any kind of pot bottle or milk carton, milk bottle or anything. You can buy these spikes, these plastic spikes to stick on the end of a pot bottle, and then you can, it has small holes in it, but you don't have to. You can actually just bury pot bottles with the lid off upside down in the soil, just deep enough that the soil holds it. And you just have a funnel to the roots and leave it in place the whole season. And you can very quickly fill these funnels with water. If you're, say, walking by with a bucket of water from the house, from the sink or something, you can quite quickly water them. So there's all kinds of gizmos for small containers, but this actually it's not particularly fancy looking, but it actually does work quite well. There's another option, which is the containers that are self-watering. If you buy these containers, they're not cheap, but on the other hand, they're very, very sturdy and quite heavy and last a long time, and the results are excellent. What this is really is a inner container that is just a little bit smaller, and it holds the soil, and the bottom of that container is perforated. Some have a mesh and some just have a lot of holes drilled in it, but the holes are small enough that the soil stays in this part. And then it's set inside a slightly bigger container where you can pour the water in and have it below the soil. And as roots stick down here, they wick water up to the soil. So the roots are not sitting in water, but there's enough of a wicking effect to keep this moist. And these big commercially made containers hold gallons of water. They're quite heavy, but you could easily go away for days in the summer and have that container still gently watering itself. And so the plants never have a period of time where the water is fluctuating. So expensive, but really good results. Of course, you can go on the internet and find umpty-ump different drawings for people that are handy, that want to basically put an inner pot inside an outer pot. And if the inner pot is suspended far enough above the bottom of the outer pot, then that can form a chamber for water. So as long as there's some kind of perforated bottom or holes, the roots can get through. And you can even buy plastic inserts. These inserts like this are actually available through various Lee Valley tools, things like that. So you can kind of retrofit a container you might have. So you're basically just having a reservoir below the wall, below the root zone. Things in pots that have to be trellised up need really stable supports. This is an extremely heavy container. This is that self-watering container again. So it's got the soil and the weight of all the water in it. So trellising the tomatoes with a support within the pot works pretty well. But if this did not have that big reservoir of water, when the soil got dry, this top might just flip over, because of tomatoes with that much fruit is extremely heavy. So there's another way to do it, which is to line pots up somewhere where you can trellis them onto strings or supports that are external. So this is a framework that's got, the pots are just sitting in front of it, and the strings are tied to an external frame that is very sturdy. And the cucumbers, there's one cucumber in each pot. These are long English cucumbers, one cucumber in each pot, and it works fine. But obviously you're not going to move those pots around. Once they're tied in, they're done. You can keep winter crops in containers. Obviously the container itself needs to be something that won't be damaged by frost. So plastic, wood, fiber, all of those work. It's most successful, though, if you can move the containers to more sheltered spots in the winter. Things are not going to grow particularly when it's cold most days, because it's just simply too cold for photosynthesis. So moving things back against buildings and into courtyards and into protected areas where the wind isn't going to blow on them, that will really help. This particular one has actually a frame. You can put a plastic cover on it, and you will have to protect them from extreme cold, just like you would for vegetables that are out in the garden. So covering them with tarps. If you've got a number of pots, you can drag them together. Now I think that's a tomato in a pot there, but if say these were all pots that had vegetables in them that you could keep in the winter, you could drag them close together and push insulation in between the cracks, so leaves or straw, which just increases the thermal mass and decreases the likelihood that that soil will freeze to the point where it would kill the plants. You can grow anything in a container that you can grow in a garden, any of the hardy things, so carrots and root crops, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. I think, probably makes the most sense to grow things like kale and chard and the hardy greens, because they are cut and come again. But certainly the winter broccoli and the winter cauliflower are hardy. Hardy leeks, you can get quite a few leeks in a pot. At the end of the season, the containers that are vulnerable to being damaged by frost need to be stored somewhere dry. So this is where, if you've got things growing in big clay planters, if they're in a plastic liner pot, you pull the plastic pot out containing the soil and the plants, then that can be outdoors for the winter, while you safely take the ceramic pot and store it somewhere where it won't get wet and freeze. So that's all vegetables. I'm actually going to go on to not fruit trees, but fruit in a moment. So any questions about vegetables in pots so far?
Linda, you
Either,
mentioned,
Dale, are you asking a question?
yeah, I am, sorry, yeah. You mentioned, for liquid, fertilizer,
Mhm.
fish fertilizer concentrate, is seaweed, do you see seaweed being of value as well?
Well, the seaweed concentrates are very low in nitrogen. You could mix them, seaweed concentrate with the fish fertilizer.
Oh, okay.
Or read the label on any of them. Fish fertilizer is a natural product, but it's not necessarily a certified organic product. So again, you need to read the
Oh.
labels. I use fish fertilizer because I'm what I call a small O organic grower. I don't have to be certified for every bit of ingredients. But if you wanted to just put sea soil in a bucket or compost in a bucket, you
Yeah.
would have an organic fertilizer too. So you can use the seaweed extract, but not by itself for the kind of nutrients that vegetables need in containers.
Oh, okay, good to know.
Something with nitrogen has to be added.
Right, okay, perfect.
Any other questions?
Linda, you said something about strawberries would grow in containers that were less than 12 inches high. Is that right? Or deep?
Yeah, and I'm
And
going to show you some pictures of strawberries in a
oh,
moment.
great. Yeah, you're just coming up to that. There was something else
Yeah.
you mentioned that I missed.
Well,
Mhm.
lettuce and herbs will do
okay.
well in those small ones. Other things, some Chinese cabbage, radishes, you can get away with the little things.
Okay.
Certainly be grown in that kind of thing. But strawberries actually do quite well, so unlike a lot of other fruit.
Okay, thanks.
So if there aren't any more questions, I will go straight to fruit. So fruit in general, particularly I'm thinking here more of the trees. Long-term drainage is critical in the soil in the pot because these are perennials. Now think about vegetables in pots. Even if it's a vegetable that goes through the winter and you harvest in the spring, it's still done that the second year. And then you can remove the old crop plant, rejuvenate the soil with compost and things. But fruit trees and fruit bushes, that kind of things, they're perennials and they just stay in the same pot year after year. So most of the soil mixes that we would use for these kinds of things have to have really generous amount of things like perlite, vermiculite, sand that make sure that the soil continues to drain. And the fertility management is even more challenging because salts build up in the soil from the fertilizer and the compost. Even, just using good organic, sea soil compost over the long term, there can be salts building up. So, you need to flush the soil thoroughly with water. Our garden soil gets flushed quite thoroughly with water in the winter, so we never have any issues out in the real world, but in pots it can be an issue. Also, because these are perennials, these plants become root bound and they periodically will have to be repotted. While they're small, you can just move up to the next size of pot, but you arrive eventually at a size of pot that is the maximum you can handle. Whether it's your bad back or your good back or just the location you're going to put it, you're going to hit a maximum. And then after that, you periodically usually have to take a fruit tree, for example, out of the pot, prune the roots back and repot it with fresh soil, as well as pruning the tops. So that is more management than you might need to do with vegetables. And in the spring, we'll feed them. You can only top dress because you won't have the opportunity to mix that soil up unless it's you're taking the opportunity to repot the plant completely. So top dressing means that you would spread the organic fertilizer on the surface of the pot and on the soil, and then you might scratch it in a little bit, but you don't want to damage the roots. So you can't dig it in or mix it in, really. It's going to have to kind of move down through the soil with watering. And these will also need the liquid fertilizer during the cropping season. Say you had a little apple tree in a pot. While the apples are sizing up, it's going to need generous water, and it's also going to need some nutrients. Not as much as vegetables, but generally we now have a plant that's not particularly well adapted to being in a pot if we're talking about a fruit tree. So non-citrus trees, so this would be like little apple trees or a little peach tree. If you're looking at this, it's a lot of sand and perlite and vermiculite and compost and garden soil. So equal parts of sand, perlite, and vermiculite, that's like 3/5 of the soil is made up of these coarse ingredients that will promote drainage and aeration. And then fish compost and garden soil. And as well, it's the same recipe for the vegetables. We need complete organic fertilizer and lime. Now for citrus, the citrus is more likely to be a fruit tree that people have in a container than some of these other, than say an apple tree. Citrus can suffer from micronutrient deficiencies pretty quickly in a pot if interestingly, as the pH rises in the pot. As the trees stay in the pot and get watered over time, the pH gets higher and higher. And the higher the pH gets, meaning less acid, the less available iron and other micronutrients are to the citrus. And you get very weirdly mottled looking leaves and deficient leaves. So they need a lot of good drainage. So coarse sand, screen bark. In this case, bark mulch is a really good ingredient in the mix. Most of what's in the pot is sand, bark mulch, perlite, vermiculite, and fish compost. So a lot of the ingredients are just there to aerate the soil and prevent compaction and allow water to drain. So screened bark mulch means if you've got wood chips or bark mulch or anything, if you can strain out the big pieces and end up with a more powdery mix, that is ideal. If you can't do screened bark mulch, then you would use peat or coir, peat moss or coir. There are complete citrus fertilizers available. Again, they will have natural ingredients in them. They're not necessarily certified organic, but they do have the right balance of nutrients for citrus trees. One of the complete organic fertilizers that could be used for citrus is the Gaia Green products. They're 444 complete organic fertilizer. It uses gypsum to supply calcium, not lime. We definitely do not want lime in citrus soil because that raises the pH and compounds the problem with the micronutrient deficiencies. So the Gaia Green product is certified organic, and you know, even our local nursery Foxglove here carries that. Strawberries in containers, I promised you I would get to that. Strawberries actually rather thrive in containers. This is a strawberry pyramid made up of a whole bunch of little pots and window boxes just piled up. Strawberry jars were always a thing, which, you know, these little pockets made, in the jar so that you could stick a plant in each little hole and fill the top with it. They're pretty productive in limited spaces when people are doing, you know, all kinds of troughs and planters, even little things you can hang on the fence. They always put strawberries in there because they have small roots and they're small plants, and the berries can hang outside the plant down, you know, off the side here, and that actually can work quite well. So they will do well. It's still the same problems that you would have with anything in a small plant container, which is watering, frequency, and nutrients. So you still have to feed them and you have to water them as frequently as anything, but at least the plants don't do too badly in this kind of situation. There are bush raspberries, and there are some other bush fruits now from the Brazelberry nursery breeders. This company has been breeding dwarf versions of raspberries, blueberries, and some other plants, particularly for use in planters and pots. And I've been growing the Brazelberry raspberry shortcake raspberries. I don't have them in a planter. I was growing them just because they're short and I didn't have to trellis them up a fence. And they're actually pretty acceptable raspberries. They're quite good. They're very productive. So you can, they're frightfully expensive. So just buy one. And in a couple of years, you'll have more raspberries than you know what to do with. I've got a whole bed of it under all my fig trees. It's just running along a fence. It all came from one plant originally. Oh, I should say, if you're tempted to do the strawberry jar or planters like this, just a little tip. When you put the soil in here, put in a layer of soil and firm it down really well. And put another layer of soil and pack it down really well. And when you come up to where the plants are being put in the holes, pack the soil around it really, you put your arm inside the jar and pack it around really well. Because if you don't, when you finally get the whole jar planted and you put some water in the top, as the soil settles, it pops, all of the berry plants pop in through the holes and get sucked inside. I know this from experience. And then you get to take them all out and start over again. So you don't want the soil to settle after you planted. You want the soil to settle as you're planting. Here is the genetic dwarf I mentioned earlier. This is a little peach tree. It's only a meter high. And you know, you're gonna get maybe 24 peaches on it, which is it's not nothing, but it's obviously you're not going to be making peach preserves anytime soon. But this is just a fiber pot, and the tree did very well in that for years. Figs and persimmons, you will see people putting them in containers. I am mystified as to why anybody would put a fig in a container, because it'll survive fine. They're tough as nails, those trees. But how many figs can you get on a tree that size? So, you know, if you want some figs, you know, a few dozens of figs, then that will work. I mean, certainly the trees will survive it. The sour citrus, the picture I showed you of the lemons was a Meyer lemon, and the Bear slime. And actually I showed you a picture of a lime much earlier on. And I've grown both of these in pots. I then planted them both outdoors after giving them quite a long time to get used to being in a pot. They really suffered being in pots eventually. And I ended up planting them outdoors. Of course, then the problem is they become very easy to grow, but very hard to get through the winter in one to survive. So the trade-off is, in pots, you've got a plant that you can readily move as soon as it gets cold. You can put it in the garage, you can put it in the greenhouse, you can drag it into the kitchen. So it'll get through the winter because the cold snaps fine, but you have a real problem managing the soil. So if you plant it outdoors, then the tree becomes absolutely carefree. You don't water it, you don't feed it. They're just fine outdoors, except a cold snap, they can freeze. So you need to put some kind of heating on it. And some people use Christmas lights. I gave up on those because they just shorted out. They were such poor quality lights these days, but I started using plumbing cables, the plumbing tapes that you put in a crawl space to prevent your plumbing from freezing. They work beautifully until one year a rat chewed the wire, and in a snowstorm in Christmas, and that was the end of my lemon tree.
Oh no.
So you know, the power can be out. That's the end of your lemon tree. The rats can chew the wire, and that's the end. So it's, you know, anybody that tries to grow a lemon in this climate, you know, you're on an edge. You know, you just have to realize you're teetering on an edge there. This is what happens to citrus trees, though, that stay in pots. It becomes quite difficult to manage this micronutrient problem. And you can do it. You can keep repotting and changing the soil, and that will help a lot. And the Gaia Green product will help a lot. So to avoid, this is iron and zinc deficiencies. These are heavy metal deficiencies due to the pH rising. So we want to keep the pH at 6, you know, keep it low. So don't overwater, keep citrus on the dry side all the time. You know, use a complete organic or complete citrus fertilizers or the Gaia Green product. And you could even use foliar feeding if necessary for micronutrients. They don't have to be kept entirely above freezing, but they'll take to 0. -2 in a pot, that's starting to be pretty dicey. -4, it will kill the tree. But then pots can be moved, you know, so all the time I had my citrus in pots, frost was never an issue because I could always move the pot. I still have the lime tree outdoors, actually. The rat did not chew the wire on that one, but I realized that it's probably just a matter of time before we have a power outage and a February cold snap. Any questions about growing fruit in containers? I forgot to mention here, I think I meant the M27 rootstock. You could grow an apple tree in a pot if it was on this really super dwarfing rootstock. But growing apples, growing the tree fruit in pots is, it's like keeping an elephant in a goat shed. It can be done, but it's not easy. Whereas things that the berries, especially strawberries, actually do pretty darn well in containers. So any questions about fruit? Alrighty, greenhouses and tunnels. And this is not a long section here. It's basically a review of some of the options because there are a lot of different options. Do you want a permanent greenhouse? Do you want something that's built to look like part of your house, in which case it probably is glass and it's more like a sun porch or an attached greenhouse? Or is a temporary thing like a tunnel going to do what you need it to do? Are you going to make it yourself? Are you going to buy a kit? Are you going to, have Hall's greenhouse people come in and do a beautiful turnkey job on a gorgeous house that they put there? So there's a lot of options that basically cost from $0 to thousands of dollars. So, are you going to heat it, or is it an unheated greenhouse? I'll have to say, in this climate, you can get a lot of use out of an unheated greenhouse. And really, unless you've got a particular reason to have tomatoes in January, then an unheated greenhouse is probably going to suit almost everybody's needs. But they can be any size, they can be plastic, they can be fiberglass, they can be glass. Again, there's cost implications for all of that. So the first thing to ask is, do you need a permanent greenhouse? Can you manage with something simpler? Elaborate cold frames, glass cold frames, beautiful cold frames can be built for far, far less than a greenhouse and do pretty much everything unheated greenhouse can do. So, you have to think about that. You can do high tunnels for spring and summer crops and just take them apart. If you're growing a greenhouse, if you're having a greenhouse to prevent late blight in your tomatoes or to have the climate warm enough to grow eggplants, then it's not really something that you need all year round. Maybe you can take it apart. Maybe just make these high tunnels. Could be homemade. There are kits, actually. These kits all screw together and the cover is already made, and you just, they're pretty economical. You do have to watch out, though, on any kit you buy, or any homemade one too, is the effect of wind here. These aren't always designed for coastal winds, so you might have to beef up the securing it down to the ground, for example, or to a foundation or something, so that you don't have wind damage. For winter things, especially because of wind, lower is better. Low tunnels actually work quite well. High tunnels catch the wind, so low profile, I just showed you this one in a different view in an earlier picture. Something like this latches down, it has little rebar legs down into the ground, so it's quite sturdy. And it's well secured. It's greenhouse film. It's not even polyplastic, which would eventually vibrate in the wind and rip in cold, winter winds can chatter that apart. This is a very, very tough covering that is sold for big greenhouses like this. And you can buy it by the meter and use it on a homemade thing. I looked at the price of these recently and they've gotten right out of line. So these plexiglass boxes are kind of neat, but holy moly, are they expensive now. Serena, you've got your hand up.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering where to, I've got some pipes to make a cloche, that I'll attach to the side of my raised beds, but I wasn't sure where to get the plastic. I wanted to get one that would last, just because I feel bad about getting plastic.
Yeah, well, there's greenhouse suppliers online that will sell retail, but I think I've seen them even listed at West Coast Seeds.
Oh,
I-
really? Okay.
Yeah, have a look at their catalog because I think they sort of sell I think they had greenhouse film.
Is that what it's called, greenhouse
It's usually
film?
called greenhouse film as opposed to like poly, which you can pretty well get anywhere,
Mhm, mhm.
So, yeah, and they're more expensive, but obviously they last a lot longer. They don't, they're very durable.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, just, wind resistance, sturdy for winter. These are some homemade ideas that people have. This is it's off in the summer and the cover goes on in the winter. My parents had for many years a system of boxes. They were all the same size, so the lids could be changed. They had quail that tore their garden apart all the time, so they just kept the quail out and kept the heat in. And here's one that's built onto a cold frame. You enter it from the back, you open the back, and you can reach in and plant things inside. There's all kinds of things that people can do. And then, there's, this is a 150-year, 200-year-old cold frames in an old manor house in England. Boy, nothing wrong with a good old glass cold frame. It works beautifully for most of what you could do in an unheated greenhouse. So again, you don't have to be quite so elaborate with the scalloped glass, but you can do something here that may serve what you need to have done and do a good job of it. In the wintertime, when it's really cold and the frame is obviously closed, these and these kinds of things as well, you still may need to throw a tarp over the top of the glazing to help hold the heat in a bit. So, but at least you can do that in a smaller structure like this. Now, when it comes to, if you decide you need a greenhouse as opposed to any of these sort of smaller, large items that I just showed you, excuse me. Again, you've got a lot of options here, from pretty economical plastic pipe to aluminum. Like powder coated aluminum is very low maintenance. It's expensive, but it's low maintenance. And wood is not cheap either, but it's very high maintenance. It's less expensive than the aluminum, but the aluminum, believe me, I put powder coated aluminum as my greenhouse, and you just, every few years you can kind of scrub it down if you need to, but it's absolutely, it's just about zero maintenance. The glazing can be glass, it can be rigid plastic, and it can be film, plastic film. It's nice to have lights and heat options, an emergency heating ability if you want it. And certainly plumbing. But I think the take-home message here is in the bottom here is most greenhouses are not designed to handle heat waves without, fans and shading or something to cool the greenhouse. And that goes for, commercially designed ones. They are just not designed to handle the kind of heat we've been getting in the summer. And, the commercial greenhouses over in the Lower Mainland, they actually have cooling systems. They don't just dump the heat or blow it out with high-speed fans, and they have enormously high-speed fans. You're just about blows your hair off to go in there because the fans are running so hard. But even so, they still have cooling, active cooling. So we really have a problem when it gets too hot in a greenhouse. And keeping things cool enough in a greenhouse is more of a problem than keeping them warm enough. So this is my greenhouse. It's attached to the house. If you do something to make it like a sun porch or a greenhouse, this has to be tempered glass according to the building code. But you can see my powder coated aluminum. It's like zero maintenance. It's really good. And it's glass. Now, glass will trap heat more than plastic does. More infrared radiation goes in through the glass and stays trapped in there than it does in some of the greenhouse film. But all greenhouses basically have an overheating problem that has to be figured out one way or the other in this climate. In the summer, this is my sweet potatoes in the back of my greenhouse, but typically people put in the hot season crops in a greenhouse, peppers and tomatoes. I find sweet basil, I just give up on trying to grow basil out in the garden. It's such a pain, but it's so easy to grow it in a greenhouse. So melons, eggplants, if you want to grow eggplants and melons, a lot of summers, really the only successful place is a greenhouse for people in cooler areas or when we're having a cool season. But it can be too hot for any of the vegetables, you know, chard and cabbage and anything like that. That's not what you would put in a greenhouse in the summer. Those can go outdoors, or they can go in the greenhouse in the wintertime. Without heating. This is my greenhouse transitioning between the peppers and the tomatoes. These are the last pepper and tomato plants. As they come out, I actually just dig plants from the garden and move them into the greenhouse. There's not time to grow a winter crop from seed underneath these plants because they're pretty packed in there, the tomatoes and peppers. And so I transplant plants from outdoors. Now this is the end of the season and it's gray days and it's no problem moving in a mature chard plant. I harvest some of the leaves off, obviously, but these great big roots, just bury them in the greenhouse soil. And before you know it, you've got sort of an instant winter garden in the greenhouse. You can sow lettuce seed in underneath tomatoes and peppers that are already growing in there for the summer. But, you know, you can just, this is actually a very good environment for all the salad greens and hardy greens, leaves, parsley. What else have I got? Chard, kale, komatsuna. I even put onion sets out there to get scallions. All of that is perfectly fine in an unheated greenhouse. But remember, in an unheated greenhouse, at 2 o'clock in the morning in January in a cold spell, it's not really much warmer at all than it is just right out in the garden. So if it's cold enough to have to throw tarps over vegetables outdoors in the winter, then throw tarps over vegetables in the greenhouse in the winter too. Just because they're in the greenhouse, they're not really going to be any warmer than outdoors on a long, long winter night. So beds versus benches. Growing in the soil, of course, is always easier as far as your management, and it's always easier on the plants. But of course, growing in pots suits people, you know, suits a green. There's a lot of things that should be in pots in greenhouses. You might have your citrus trees in pots and sweet potatoes and herbs and all sorts of things. So in my greenhouse, it's half and half. I have a bed in the front and shelves on the back, and the gravel in the back is wide enough to put pots. So you have to just think about what you are going to grow. For vegetables, though, anytime you can grow as many as possible in an in-ground bed, the easier it's going to be. Just going to be more stable temperatures for the roots. And it's going to be easier to manage the soil. Now, greenhouse soil is on a different planet than your garden soil, because it's now going to have this cover over it. It won't be rained on all winter. So that means a couple things. One is that you don't get the leaching effect, losing the nutrients, but you also don't have the acidifying effect that we have outdoors. The heavy rainfall, that is one of the factors that reduces our pH and makes more acid soil. So in a greenhouse, that soil, that's not happening anymore. So you may start with garden soil in the greenhouse and you amend it to get the pH to the zone for vegetables, but then you may not have to amend it much in the future. So you should check your greenhouse soil always. Whenever you're checking pH, check the greenhouse soil as well, and don't assume that it's like the garden soil anymore, even if they started out being the same soil. You know, 22 years ago, my greenhouse soil just came from my garden, but they're completely different now as far as how I manage them. And you do need to amend the soil in the beds like you do for a garden, which is regular compost, but liming is probably something you won't continue to do. If the pH gets too high, we may even need to acidify that soil with lots of organic matter and make sure that we're using organic fertilizer products that have gypsum instead of lime to provide calcium, because plants still need the calcium. The liming does provide the calcium and modifies the pH, but if we still need calcium, we can't use lime, then we use gypsum. So the big challenge, as I mentioned, for greenhouses is how to keep them cool enough. Easily, it can be 30 degrees or in the 80s in my greenhouse in February. In the summer, it can easily be 40 or 100 degrees in there. And when it gets that hot, it kills the pollen on peppers and tomatoes. It kills cucumbers, the little tiny cucumbers on the vines. And the flowers just drop right off. If the pollen is been sterilized by heat, the flower doesn't form a fruit at all. And you may not even notice, except that you just didn't get much crop. You know, just like, didn't really get any peppers. I saw some flowers and I never saw any fruit. Well, it can be the heat. And it just takes a few hours in the middle of the day of excessive heat to sterilize whatever flowers were on the plants at that time. When it cools off later and the weather gets cooler, the new flowers will be okay, but you can lose a fair bit of crop in an overheated greenhouse. So ventilation is essential, but it may not be possible to ventilate enough by opening vents or putting in new vents and opening doors. You may have to have fans, and you may need shade cloth. 50% shade cloth, which is what I'm showing in the picture here, blocks half the light. And it cools, but it reduces the light levels, but the plants can still survive for the heat wave. So they're getting enough light to carry on. But because it does reduce light levels, you just shade the greenhouse for vegetables during the heat waves. So it should be something where it's easy to get the shade cloth on and off. In my greenhouse, the picture I showed you with that high glass, it's really, I can't put shade cloth on top of my greenhouse. So I actually put the shade cloth over the plants inside the greenhouse. And that's adequate, you know, and I've got a lot of ventilation. But you get a thermometer and put it in your greenhouse and just find out what's going on. Is how hot is it actually getting during the day? Because that is going to really determine how successful your tomatoes and things are. As far as watering goes, things, of course, are going to dry out very fast in a greenhouse. It's going to need more watering than a garden outdoors. It's much more like trying to keep plants in containers watered. You can certainly mulch the soil. You can treat this soil in the greenhouse just like your garden soil, mulch it, irrigate it, feed it. All the same things apply.
Linda, can I interrupt for a moment?
Sorry?
May I interrupt you? I'm sorry. I know it's hard when you're in a flow with what you're talking about. May I ask a question?
Sure. Yes, of course.
Regarding the greenhouse, you mentioned that you shade the plants, but when the temperature in the greenhouse is that high, how does shading the plants help with that?
Well, it still helps. It's better than having the plant be in full sun. So, I mean, that has the full, I mean, I'm still moving the air out of there with a fan, but yeah, no, shading the plants is a second best option. The best thing is to shade the whole greenhouse.
Okay, thank you.
But it does work to shade the plants. And I use, I often don't put the shade cloth in. I use all the lace tablecloths and things I've gotten from the thrift shop, which are white, and they really shade a lot. And then I take them up during the day. I take them up, I put them out when it's the hottest part of the day, and I fold them back up again and let the plants get some light in the morning and in the evening. It's a bit elaborate. It's a little easier. It would be easier to shade the greenhouse. I actually have, in fact, shaded the greenhouse externally just on the, I can go back to the greenhouse here, just on the external upright side. That's possible to do. And here, I can hang shade cloth on the front here. And that has actually worked quite well as well. But I'm getting to an age where climbing up on ladders and putting things over is not something I want to do anymore. So it's a consideration now. You know, I built this greenhouse 22 years ago. I did not realize that I was going to get into having to cool this greenhouse as much as I have been. So I can't, emphasize enough that cooling is probably going to be your challenge, not heating. Oh, actually, that was my last slide, Leanne. You were right on schedule there. Before we meet again, which will be the first week of May, obviously we can plant we should be able to plant our cool weather vegetables. You won't be able to put seeds of beans and corn outdoors, but you could start them indoors and have them ready to go out later in May. It may or may not be warm enough for tomatoes and zucchini. Tomatoes and zucchini are among the more vigorous warm weather crops that can put up with more. But we're not going to be putting melons and cucumbers and peppers and stuff like that out. There's just no way it's going to be ready then. And in the first week of May, if you're interested in growing onion sets, I'll talk about how to do that, because the first week of May is when we would sow the seeds for onion sets. So you sow just a little patch of onion seed very densely. So you basically grow little tiny miniature onions all summer and then harvest them, and then you can plant them next spring in your garden. So we'll talk about that more next time. So we're going to talk about the summer garden, having plants for the summer, which is tomatoes, peppers, that sort of thing. So any questions? We've got a few minutes left here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
I do have a question, Linda.
Sure.
You earlier expressed a concern about the cost of vermiculite and that you're essentially not considering using